Good evening. My name is Reverend Melanie Marshbaum, and I'm one of the pastors here at Church of the Covenant. And on behalf of our entire worshiping community, I want to thank you for being with us here this evening to listen to Dr. Willie Parker speak. We are honored and humbled to be able to host this gathering this evening, and so humbled and honored as well that so many people would turn up to a church to attend this event. I know that it can often seem as though people of faith speak with one voice on the issue of abortion rights, but we strive to acknowledge that is not necessarily true, that there are many voices and many viewpoints even within the religious community. And so we are very honored to be able to host this conversation and welcome some different viewpoints to the table. We hope that you will feel very welcome here this evening. And now I would like to introduce Chris from Preterm.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm glad to see everybody here tonight. I want to thank not only the Church of the Covenant for hosting us, but our many community partners who reached out to spread the word about tonight's event and spread the word you did. We're pretty full. Thank you. A couple housekeeping things. Max Back's Books, I got that right, is selling Dr. Parker's book in the back, and they are donating a portion of the proceeds to Preterm. So if you want to get a signed book afterwards, please do that. And Jo Byrne of See Your Words is a graphic artist, and she will be doing and creating a beautiful graphic that you can look at afterwards. I'm sure that I'm not alone in feeling like this, but it seems lately like the world is a pretty unjust place. And how those injustices impact us depends on the color of our skin, who we pray to, how much money is in our wallets, whether we call ourselves male or female, or something completely different. I'm honored to present a man who truly lives his values. He really does. And in his worldview, injustice is seeing something that needs to be done and not doing it. Dr. Parker is a practicing OBGYN physician. For a number of years, he had a pretty nice life practicing in Hawaii. As a Christian, he had made the decision not to perform abortions, but that he would refer women who wanted them to another physician who could. He increasingly found himself in the morally uncomfortable place of not being able to provide abortion care to his patients who needed them. Knowing that he needed more training to become a skilled provider, he had the opportunity to become the first family planning fellow at the University of Michigan. In 2007, there weren't a lot of places where one could go to learn how to do second trimester procedures. So he did some of his training at Preterm. We were happy to have him, and I'm very grateful for his work and his support of and his voice in this movement. In his book, he writes, "I wanted to know how to handle a patient's anxiety and her tears. I wanted to be good, so incontrovertibly, undeniably expert at providing compassionate abortion care that no woman would ever cause to suffer an ounce of additional anguish at my hands." And I think that shows and says pretty clearly what kind of man he is and what kind of physician he is. He also shows us that science and religion are not mutually exclusive. He has a deep, abiding respect for women and for his patients. And he has chosen to use his role as a physician, a feminist, an activist to change the conversation on abortion in this country. And it's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. Willie Parker.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's my privilege to be here with you today. And sometimes you have to recognize special moments. And the way I've chosen to do that is to take in all the moments. Because you never know when those things come around again. I'm grateful to be here today. And I'm grateful to you for coming to this event. Let me just take a moment to acknowledge my family members who are in the audience, not the family that I was born into, but rather the family that I chose, and that is my working family, and we chose each other. So I'm grateful to Chrissy Francis and Preterm Clinic for the investment that they made in me a few years ago about acquiring the skills to take good care of women, but also having the vision to bring me here to be in community with you tonight. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to take some time and dive into what people have been interested in with regard to why I wrote this book, called Life's Work, A Moral Argument for Choice. Just as an abortion provider, making the decision to do this work has been monumental, and to be certain, life's work is about my own personal journey around becoming an abortion provider, but that's not the reason why I wrote the book. As a result of being on this journey, one that for me has been rewarding, where I provide care for women who are in situations where no one else would help them, to the degree that this work has been difficult at all, it's been increasingly made so by people opposed to abortion, some of whom showed up outside tonight, to list and to state that they are opposed to abortion on account of moral grounds. And the moral grounds that they often raise are related to their particular religious understanding. That understanding is often one of fundamentalist Protestant Christianity or extreme Catholicism. And it's been interesting, but it's only been once in a meeting that I've had anyone to pose a non-religious objection to abortion. And it was a woman in Utah who expressed what felt to me like very Victorian ideas around female sexuality, and that she said that any woman who gets pregnant always had the choice to just keep her legs closed. She also expressed some sense of entitlement around having lost the opportunity to have grandchildren, which is to say either her son and his partner decided to end the pregnancy, or maybe one of her daughters. But certainly, to the degree that I've heard any resistance to abortion at all, it's been a religious voice, and the loudest and most insistent ones do so on the basis that their religion forbids them to support a woman making the choice to control her life or to take care of her health. And so that leads many in our society, because they don't hear anything otherwise, to believe that abortion requests or the provision of that service is immoral in general and non-Christian in particular. So I found it to be problematic that people thought that way, because I, as a Christian, was never taught that abortion was wrong, and I've never been personally opposed to it, and my personal religious conversion predates the whole pro-life, pro-choice narrative. But I also have never concluded that it was immoral for a woman to take care of herself or to make decisions for herself in the same way that men take for granted. So it was also because of my Christian beliefs that I believe that the most important connection that you can have to a person who's not your family member and they need your help is to be one of compassion. And for that reason, I provide abortions because I'm a Christian and not in spite of it. Now, I know that that statement is problematic for many, and some of you may even be here in the house tonight. And in fact, I hope that there are some people here who heard about the book and its premise and who have decided to engage in a dialogue that quite possibly will lead us to honest disagreement. I say honest disagreement indeed because, according to the Mahatma Gandhi, honest disagreement can be the beginning of progress. And I think that we need to make major progress on this issue because the issue that requires us to have honest dialogue would allow us to ask what we've been unable to do up to this point, and that is to ask the right questions. Because a question appropriately asked is 50% answered. And I think the question that I want to have answered is to have a clearer understanding and an exchange that may lead to mutual honest disagreement, but it will allow us to step off of the notion of common ground, because I'm uncomfortable standing on common ground when the ground on which we're standing are the lives and the health of women. So I'd rather honestly disagree with you and move away to our corners to try and actualize our ideas politically than to have women held in balance and to stand on them in order to validate some notion that I hold. So I'm hoping that this conversation tonight, if it ends up being one where we end up with mutual honest disagreement, will be one that leave women and leave us all in a better place. So what I want to do is have audience with you and read a few passages from my book that will address three major questions that I've been fielding since I now have the public space in this platform of having a book that talks about the moral argument for choice. You might notice that the title is not the religious argument for choice, but it's the moral argument, because morality may not have anything to do with religious understanding. And in fact, as a Christian, I jokingly say, my job as a Christian is to convince non-Christians that Christians can be moral. Because sometimes I think they wonder if that's really the case. So let me start by reading from a chapter in my book called Women. And I like to start with this because it's the first chapter in my book, because it's what this work is all about for me. It's about the women. And I intentionally started the book with those who have abortions because those who are apathetic about abortion often believe that they don't know anyone who's had an abortion. And those who are hostile towards abortion are often unaware that the people that join them in opposing abortion have either had abortions or they're partnered with women who've needed them. So by reading this passage, I want to make clear that with a frequency of about 1 in 4 women in this country by the age of 45, I want to make sure that we understand that the women who have abortions are all of us and none of us. The women. Their legs jiggle on vinyl upholstery. They look into their laps. They get lost in their phones. On a single day in Montgomery between the hours of, say, 6:30 and noon, I will perform at least 24 abortions, and the women who come to see me are of every race. Most of them range in age from 19 to nearly 40, although sometimes I see girls as young as 12, shocked and confused by their current circumstances and waiting with their mothers. The people who passed the new laws concern themselves with fetuses, but these are the real humans I'm caring for, real people, not merely biological organisms with the potential to become such. These individuals have full, messy, imperfect lives and hopes and dreams that will or won't come true. Aren't they entitled to be the authors of their own stories, to find their own victories and happinesses, to make their own mistakes without a Congress of legislators dictating what they must do? They are college students, married women, single women, mothers, women without children. In a single morning, in fact, I might see a woman about to enter the Army, or a first grade teacher, or an x-ray technician, or a long-haired girl whose body is covered with tattoos, including one that says, "All things through Christ who strengthens me." Sometimes they use words like my boyfriend or my husband, and sometimes they speak more euphemistically, as in this person that I'm dealing with, or I don't usually have sex. But one act of sexual intercourse has brought these women here, but on the day of their abortion, the men are on the outskirts of their lives, waiting for them in the trucks or SUVs that they keep idling in the parking lot or by the curb. This, the abortion clinic, is a woman's world. On the day of the procedure, I do an ultrasound to determine the gestational age of the fetus. And when I ask the woman if she wants to see the image on the screen, as I'm required in Alabama by law to do, quite a few say yes. This impulse, I believe, is the opposite of the heartless or the morbid. The women to whom I provide this service are clear-eyed, able to make able to sort through all the different factors of their lives. They have the clarity that they need and that I require of them before I will perform a procedure. But because they are human and not robots or gods, they will never have the degree of certainty that the antis demand of them. They have determined at this time what is right for them and their families. And in keeping with my ethical and Christian commitment not to make value judgment about individual women's choices, I do not interrogate them about the circumstances that brought them here, unless, of course, there's something illegal or unethical like incest at play, or that I feel that a woman's being coerced. But if they ask me questions, as they frequently do, I answer them as their doctor, not as their confessor or as their friend, and I give them the medical truth. Before 22 weeks, a fetus is in no way equal to a baby or a child. It cannot survive outside the uterus because it cannot breathe, not even with a respirator. It cannot form anything like thoughts. Up until 29 completed gestational weeks, despite what the antis may say, the scientific consensus is that it cannot feel anything like pain. I tell women that having this abortion will not impede their future ability to have children, as many as they want, as long as their fertility persists. I do not engage in or perpetuate any of our society's cultural, sentimental notions about the primacy of motherhood in women's lives. I regard this meeting of sperm and egg as a biological event, no less miraculous but morally and qualitatively different from a living, breathing human life, imbued with sacredness only when the mother or the parents deem it so. My job, as I see it, is not to encourage or to discourage women from having abortions, but rather to deploy my medical expertise in the service of their free choice, whatever that may be. And for their part, most women are relieved to be, at last, in this judgment-free zone. They understand that they've made a decision with certain consequences, and having chosen at this juncture to terminate their pregnancy, most of them are able to live fully with the complexity of that choice. Sometimes the women are tearful as they look at me or at the sonogram picture, but as I learned a long time ago, tearfulness does not equal uncertainty. As I see it, the desire to see the sonogram image is a cry of decisiveness. This is real. This is what I'm doing. This is what I want. And having decided in the moment of my unique individual human life, I've decided not to follow a different path. So it's later on when they are on the table and the weeks of pent-up anxiety turns to relief that a floodgate, now that the anticipation is over, that floodgate opens and that women start to tell me their stories unprompted. One woman says that she was so sick with her first pregnancy that she had to be hospitalized. Now the mother of a single parent of a 9-year-old son, she can't afford to be hospitalized again. Another plans to join the Army and is already arranging to leave her 2 very young children with her mother in signing papers that make them the custodians should something fatal happen to her in the line of duty. A third is following her husband's job to a big city in the north, and she will need to resume a full-time corporate career just to make ends meet. There's a recently divorced mother of 3 with a 1-year-old at home. There are athletes and dancers with their eyes on big dreams like the Olympics or Alvin Ailey. There are women studying for degrees, hoping to become therapists, biologists, teachers, and nurses. There are also drug addicts, sorority sisters, women in denial about fundamental truths in their lives, women who consent to be in destructive relationships that are impossible to understand. On occasion, I see the same woman sometimes twice in 4 months. Like all people everywhere, the women in these clinics are, for better or for worse, merely humans doing the best they can, making this decision having taken everything into account. But no matter what brought them here, they do not deserve to bear the brunt of a culture's historic and dysfunctional shame. I'm thinking now of a patient who sought to terminate her pregnancy because she was unmarried, though in a long-term relationship, and the leader of a Christian youth group. Feeling that she could not model, quote, appropriate Christian behavior under these circumstances as a pregnant single Christian woman, she had an abortion instead. Now, I didn't say this to her at the time, but this is how I felt. How much better would it have been for her to work through her real-life dilemma in an open and honest way for the kids she taught and not default to some rigid understanding of how Christian women ought to behave? A third of American women have had abortions, but a fraction of them are brave enough to stand up and to tell their stories. I've found that when women do share their experiences of abortion out loud and with with one another and with their partners, they do so much to push away stigma and shame for themselves and for all women who feel silenced and blamed. So women are all of us, right? There's no typical abortion patient. They're just women who have unplanned pregnancies and who have to decide what to do with them. And then there's the rest of us. Whether we can become pregnant or whether we've ever been pregnant, we decide how to treat those women. I was telling Chrissy on the way over, Roe v. Wade didn't give women the right to have abortions. Roe v. Wade made sure that women didn't die from unsafe abortions. You don't give women choice. Women make the choices that they want to make. All we get to decide as a society if those choices will be safe. The second question that I feel frequently is, what kind of man, who does abortions? What kind of guy? And certainly, who would dare call himself a Christian and do abortions? And so people have been trying to figure me out. And when I became public about my faith identity as an abortion provider, the criticism changed. The criticism went from initially being abortion is wrong, and of course he does abortions. He's amoral or immoral because he's a heathen. But when I claimed a Christian identity, the conversation now changed to it's irrelevant about the morality of abortion. The argument is that you cannot be authentically Christian. And so for now, it seems to be more profitable or more strategic for them to deconstruct or debunk the notion that I could be authentically Christian than to criticize abortion. And so there are people who are wondering, who is this guy who calls himself a Christian and does abortions? And so the prequel, I'm going to read to you from a passage from the book called Conversion. And it tells why, as somebody who had, by every metric, a very good life, living in a penthouse in Hawaii, where you could see the ocean from about here, that I would give that up to face a life of ridicule and scorn and perhaps even danger. So this passage will give you a little bit of insight into why I made that decision. And the prequel is I had been working in a clinic in Hawaii, and Hawaii was one of the first states to legalize abortion, and we were providing care, even though I didn't provide the care, we were providing care for our patients. And an administrator who was born-again Christian, who was a nice guy, but who thought that it was within his administrative purview to stop us from providing that care, put me personally in crisis around what to do as someone who's charged with providing health care for women, and now a very vital service was being taken from them in the context of the same reason why I now provide abortions. He said that his Christianity told him that abortion shouldn't be done, and I ultimately came to say that my Christianity said abortions should be done, have to be done, and that I should do them. So this is passages from the chapter called Conversion. In retrospect, I had already deferred this moment for far too long. I had refused to perform abortions out of loyalty to my Christian identity, but I had evolved a great deal since my Christian conversion at 15, and other identities had long since grown up beside it. At 41, I was a Christian, yes, but I was also a doctor and a healthcare provider for poor women, and I was and am a man who loves women in partnership and friendship at work and in my family. I didn't do abortions, but I had seen enough patients in my dozen years as an OBGYN and grown close to enough women in my life to know that all kinds of women sometimes find themselves pregnant and unable or unwilling to raise a child. Sometimes these instances are so striking that it's impossible to not see abortion as a palliative solution to psychic pain. Before coming to Hawaii, I had worked for 3 years as a government doctor in Merced, California, where there was a shortage of medical care. And one day, a young woman, 18 or 19 years old, came into my office. She was alone, having driven herself to the clinic from her home of some 20 miles away. This woman had become pregnant through incest by her father, a very controlling, overbearing, and religious man. She was Latina, from a family of migrant workers, raised in a community defined by patriarchal hierarchy. Because she was not a minor or dependent, I had no legal duty to report this tragic situation, and I knew enough about rape to understand that involving law enforcement without the consent of the woman could make her life circumstances even worse. In an extreme sense, this woman was doing what was expected of her, which is to say she was living in her father's house until she moved ultimately to her husband's. That made her vulnerable in the way that women are. In light of these facts, her bravery, that is, coming to me by herself and seeking my help, struck me as extraordinary. But I couldn't do abortions, and so I referred her to the closest clinic I could, which was about 50 miles away. But I remember thinking at that moment, if I had the skills to do her abortion, I would have done it right then and there. My audio tape collection was by serendipity queued up on the day that I returned home after being told that we would not be able to provide abortions for our patients in the clinic. It was queued up that day to the I've Been to the Mountaintop, Dr. King's final sermon, which I'd heard dozens, maybe hundreds of times, and I could recite whole sections of it word for word from memory. For when people get caught up in that which is right and they are willing to sacrifice for it, he said, there's no stopping short of victory. But on that afternoon, as I wrestled with the fact that certain women were being denied health care services they sought because of someone else's idea of what they should do, I heard this sermon with new ears. As he nears his final rousing lines of the speech, "Let us rise up tonight with greater readiness," Dr. King recounts a story from the Gospels, one that every Christian knows by heart and one that I myself was taught in Sunday school. In the story of the Good Samaritan, a man is lying wounded and helpless on the Jericho road, having been beaten up. He fell in with thieves, as Dr. King put it. Two men, a priest and a Levite, the first obligated to help others by vocation, and the second, with blood ties to the victim, bypassed the man, leaving him lying in the road. Finally, a Good Samaritan, a man with no professional or familial tie, got down from his beast and decided not to be compassionate by proxy, as Dr. King said. The Samaritan administered first aid and helped the man in need. Of the three, only the Samaritan was great, Jesus said. In his sermon, Dr. King begins to speculate almost sardonically about the reasons why the first two might have hurried past this man as wounded and as desperate as the traveler was. You can sort of hear Dr. King's humor in this sermon. He says, maybe they were frantically busy and late for a church meeting. Or maybe they were following a religious edict that required priests and Levites not to contaminate themselves by touching another human body in advance of a religious ritual. Or maybe they were devoted to a broader kind of civic assistance. Perhaps they had joined a committee to improve the safety of travelers, the Jericho Road Improvement Association, as Dr. King put it. Maybe they felt that it was better to deal with the problem from the causal root rather than to get bogged down with an individual effect. Outside my penthouse, in the meantime, the sun was going down, and then in the sermon, Dr. King got to his point. It's possible that those men were afraid, he said. The Jericho Road's a dangerous road, and in Jesus' day, it was teeming with thieves. It was possible, Dr. King suggests, that the priest and the Levite were worrying first and foremost about their own skins and wished not to draw unwelcome attention or danger to themselves by dismounting from their animals or lingering over a person too disabled to be quick in an emergency. Or it's possible that they felt that the man on the ground was merely faking, part of a scheme to lure unwitting, soft-hearted travelers into an ambush. The bottom line is that the priest and the Levite passed the man by because their first thought, Dr. King suggested, was fear for themselves. If I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? What made the Good Samaritan good in Dr. King's interpretation was that he reversed the question. He said, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? And all of a sudden, it was like a punch in my spiritual gut. The scripture came alive and it spoke to me. For the Samaritan, the person in need was a fallen traveler. For me, it was a pregnant woman. For me, the earth spun, and with it, this question turned on its head. It became not, is it right for me as a Christian to perform abortions, but rather, is it right for me as a Christian not to perform them? And in that instant, I understood that I, like the Levite and the priest, had been afraid of what my Christian brothers and sisters might think of me, of what my pastors and relatives in Birmingham might say, of what the social or political consequences of fully embracing the cause of abortion might be. I had been worried, if the truth be told, about tarnishing my stellar career and reputation. I was already speaking out on domestic violence and sexual assault. Wasn't that enough? My love for my cushy situation was fighting for its life, and my conscience my conscience prevailed. I had erred too long on the side of caution, just as I did when in my senior year of college at Berea College, I declined to join a campus-wide protest against Berea's investment in South Africa as apartheid, being afraid that someone might develop a negative opinion about me and ruin my chances for getting into medical school, a demurral that I regret deeply to this day. So that's the guy. That's why I provide abortions. And some people ask me almost daily, and in multiple interviews, they always ask me, are you afraid? People have been killed for doing what you do. And I guess it's not a question of whether or not I'm afraid, it's a question of what I'm afraid of. And I'm not afraid of physical death because I'm clear about the fact that life is fatal. Nobody's getting out alive. But I am afraid of a sort of a spiritual death, existential death, a death of meaning and purpose, a sense of being aware that you're on the planet but not knowing why you're here. And I had a taste of what that would feel like when I compromised myself and failed to participate in the anti-apartheid movement. And so I can live with the anxiety that someone might try and harm me for what I do. They've done it. You know, there have been 4 people who've been killed. I had met Dr. George Tiller personally. But I can live with that, but I don't know that I could live with looking in the mirror daily and saying that I was too afraid to do what I knew was the right thing to do. And so for me, that conversion to becoming an abortion provider was as pronounced as my religious and spiritual conversion of becoming a Christian. And I simply can't or won't unconvert. The third thing that I want to talk about is the whole question of religion and the religious opposition to abortion. And I personally believe that it resides in 2 thoughts. One, that all women were made to or should want to become mothers. And number 2, that life begins at conception, and therefore any intentional disruption of that human life process constitutes murder. Now, the passage that I'm going to read now addresses these 2 facts, and it also expresses the notion that the understanding that life begins at conception is a relatively new one, and it's also an ahistorical one, because people in Christianity did not share this opinion early on. And this reading is from the chapter called Preaching Truth. One of the many cultural falsehoods that I most rail against is this: each and every abortion is a terrible tragedy, and every woman who chooses to have an abortion is therefore a tragic figure. In this popular narrative, women are helpless victims and not clear-eyed individuals making a sensible choice to benefit themselves and the people around them. I know from seeing women every day how far this is from being true. Most of the women I see are utterly matter-of-fact about what they're doing. They're on my table because they need to be. But the tragic heroine narrative supports what I call the politics of respectability, a cultural set of unexamined assumptions that go like this: women who make autonomous decisions about their sexual pleasure and their fertility are bad, and an unplanned or unintended pregnancy represents a grave error in judgment. The highest calling of every woman is to become a mother, and if a woman does not choose to become a mother, then something is wrong with her. She is deficient somehow and not all there. And if the choice to have an abortion automatically puts a woman's fundamental competency into question, then it stands to reason that in the eyes of the antis and those who support them, that she must be protected from herself. It may be difficult in a misogynist culture to regard women who freely choose sex and who freely choose to have abortions when they need to as free agents taking their own lives into their own hands. But the alternative is to see them as less than fully human and requiring a paternalistic intervention, something I refuse to do. Another so-called fact put forth by the antis is that life begins at conception, the justification for the ridiculous claim that abortion is murder. As a Christian and a scientist, I can authoritatively attest that life does not begin at conception. This notion that the union of the egg and sperm constitutes a new person at that moment reflects a religious belief and a deeply held one. But the fact is, as Justice Harriet Blackmun so eloquently wrote back in 1973 in the majority opinion in Roe v. Wade, there is no historical, philosophical, theological, or even scientific consensus on when life begins. So while the modern Roman Catholic hierarchy might regard each instance of fertilization as a sacred event, this belief is not and has never been universal amongst Christians. 1,000 years ago, it was common for people to believe, as the Greeks did, that fetuses only possess what they called a vegetable soul up until 40 to 80 days of gestation, at which point God imbued them with a human soul. Even Thomas Aquinas, who established much of what is contemporary Catholic theology, believed that abortion was homicide only after the moment of ensoulment, at 40 to 80 days, 40 days for a boy and 80 days for a girl. And when you know that women are late even to their own ensoulment. So says patriarchal thinking and logic. Until the rise of the national prominence of the moral majority before the presidential election of 1980, life begins at conception was not central to the mainstream Protestant belief, and abortion was not explicitly forbidden. The fact is that for the most of modern Western history, abortion, which until the advent of modern surgical procedures in the 20th century involved the ingestion of toxic herbs, roots, and potions to restore menses, abortion has been regarded by common law as the legal and moral prerogative of pregnant women up until the moment of quickening, the first maternal perception of fetal movement in utero, which usually occurs around 20 weeks. Indeed, the first anti-abortion laws were enacted in the middle of the 19th century to protect women from buying and drinking poisons peddled to them by charlatans, and not because jurors had any notions or opinions about the so-called rights of any early stage embryo or fetus. But this falsehood that life begins at conception has become so commonplace in our culture as to seem, even to the supporters of abortion rights, as self-evident. And when a majority of voters unthinkingly concede its veracity, then legislators can enact all kinds of mischief in proposing bills to equate the rights of a fetus at any stage post-fertilization with that of a living, breathing human person, and any termination of pregnancy as murder. You know that all too well here in Ohio. Laws in Missouri and Kansas say that life begins at conception. Bills proposing that fetuses are people have come before legislatures in at least 28 states, and none have passed. Based on what we know scientifically about human reproduction and embryology, I like to say that life is a process. It is not a switch that can be turned on or off in an instant like an electric light. Instead, life before and after conception is a galaxy of contingent, interconnected conditions that must be met in order for a single human to achieve progress, maturation, or fulfillment. In the words of one of my Jewish friends' mother, viability is when you graduate from college and have a job. So that shows that religious plurality means that we have to stick to science. Life happens whether individual women and men choose to participate in the process of reproduction or not. The scientific truth which touches every living thing in the natural world is that in the process of life, from fertilization until death, all sorts of events can arise and interrupt maturation. All beings perish for all kinds of reasons, but that finitude does not in every case equal murder. It is worth mentioning here, though it may seem obvious, that the advocates of capital punishment in this country, who are frequently the same people who oppose abortion rights, do not regard a death sentence in which a living, breathing human life is extinguished by the state as murder. Instead, they call it justice. The hypocrisy of the political right on capital punishment and abortion is more evidence, in my opinion, that we cannot adjudicate these questions of life in the realm of opinion and religious belief. Science is the only judge before which each and every party stands entirely equal. So, calling for that kind of nuanced thinking around the issue that we call life, there's a scientific meaning and a non-scientific meaning for that term. The call that we make sure that everybody stays in their lane. Down south we say, when you stay in your own lane, there's no traffic. We need to make sure that when we're making policy-related decisions, that those are based on evidence And we need the wisdom of both science and religion at this moment in time because, as Dr. King said, science gives mankind or humankind knowledge, which is power. Religion gives humankind wisdom, which is control. The two are not enemies. Science deals mainly with facts. Religion deals mainly with values. And what time period, if not now, then whenever have we needed to have rigor and integrity in our values and in our facts? The final thing that I want to read for you is, I call it pulling back the curtain. Do you remember in The Wizard of Oz, when they get to Oz and they see the mighty, powerful wizard, and Toto runs over and pulls the curtain back, and Dorothy gets pissed because she sees this little impish man making this grandiosity, and she says to him, you know, you're a very mean man. And he says, I'm not a mean man, I'm just a horrible wizard. And so what I want to do is pull back the curtain on the wizard around the whole issue of the black genocide argument, because we are in an era where people are pulling out all the stops, and they are making strategic decisions about how to pursue their anti-abortion agenda at the cost of many people. And I think this chapter that I want to read in its entirety is very short. It's called Abortion and the Black Genocide and the White Majority, because I think it helps to connect some dots, and it helps us to make sense of many things that are happening in our society, including what happened in Charlottesville a little bit over a week ago. So this is chapter 9 in the book, my favorite chapter, and it's called Black Genocide and the Abortion Movement. And I just want to offer a disclaimer before I read this, that when I wrote this, I was not smoking or drinking anything that altered my consciousness. Nothing enrages me more than the anti's most recent strategic gambit, the Black Genocide Movement, launched in its current iteration in 2009 by white anti-abortion activists in Georgia. It is a craven and cynical effort to get black people to regard the clinical practice of abortion, as well as the whole abortion rights movement, as an assault by white America on blacks. Banking on the fact that 37% of women who seek abortion in America are black, the Black Genocide Movement positions Planned Parenthood as the main perpetrator of this genocide, and the birth control pioneer Margaret Sanger as its primary architect. The Black Genocide Movement is nothing more than a conspiracy theory, pretending that abortion is a white plot to kill black babies, and that by raising this awareness, millions of black lives are protected from slaughter. As an African-American abortion provider who grew up in poverty, I take this accusation that I am somehow complicit in this white plot very personally. It is true that because poor women and women of color have less access to reliable birth control and health care, that they are more likely than privileged women to have unplanned pregnancies. They are also less likely to have taken comprehensive sex ed in school, and the conditions of their lives are often chaotic and unstable, which can lead to complex, less than socially acceptable decision-making. They probably choose medication abortion less frequently than their peers, but that data is hard to find because they tend to make their abortion decisions at a later gestational age. These women, or black women, walk into abortion clinics more frequently than privileged women. Not necessarily because they don't want a child or another child, many do, but because the circumstances of their lives are constraining and prohibitive. Women of all races and socioeconomic groups cite multiple reasons for seeking an abortion: lack of financial resources, relationship instability, more children at home. But this multiplicity of factors disproportionately afflict poor women and women of color. I see it all the time. The implication that in their effort to preserve their own sanity and resources and to save their own lives, that black women are murderers, makes me want to lash out like Jesus at overthrowing the tables in the temple. The Black Genocide Movement is a trumped-up political play to gain advantage. Cynically disguised as civil rights, it targets the most vulnerable women and pits their pregnancy against their own self-interest. In doing so, the Black Genocide Movement only serves to compound the misery of people who are already living in circumstances of poverty and pain and deprivation. I first saw the Black Genocide billboards on highways running through mainly African-American neighborhoods in Atlanta and New York. One of them had a gigantic photograph of a beautiful African-American child, and it said, "Black children are an endangered species." Another said, "The most dangerous place for a black baby is in the womb." A third had a picture of President Barack Obama and read, "Every 21 minutes, our next possible leader is aborted." These signs prey upon Black women's traditional sense of responsibility to their community, and they imply that they have some sort of duty, higher than to themselves, to continue a pregnancy. In 2009, a white pro-life filmmaker named Mark Crutcher produced a documentary-style propaganda piece called Ma'afa 21, which equates abortion by Black women to slavery and the eugenics experiments of the first half of the 20th century. Positioned as a civil rights film, it circulated widely amongst various African American groups. After it came out, I read an interview with a young, well-educated student at Morris Brown College who said that having seen the movie, she now understood that there was a conspiracy to kill Black people, implying that she would factor that line of reasoning into her decision-making process should she ever find herself needing an abortion. Now, this young woman was on track to realize her hopes and dreams, and it anguished me that based on these lies, that she was willing to go off track, to risk poverty for herself and for her prospective child, which was precisely what the white purveyors of these lies hoped that she would do. Now when I see a patient like this in one of the clinics where I work, and I sense that she's wavering based not on her own inner voice, but because of some propaganda she's encountered somewhere, I do my best to rebuild her self-esteem and her dignity. I tell her that her decision to care for herself is not in conflict with any duty she may or may not have to other people who look like her. I tell her that the shame that she feels is a product of outside forces who want her to feel that way, not because people care about her, but because as a poor woman or as a woman of color, she's an easy target. She can be made into an example to further somebody else's agenda. I remind her that before she can ever help anyone else, that she must first help herself. I seldom see women who genuinely want to change their minds based on this propaganda. Most are resolute. They're committed to their course of action, but they are often distressed by the social pressures they feel from the forces such as the Black genocide movement. I encourage these women to act on their own behalf and to feel the power of their own agency. The truth, I'm convinced, and this is the good part, is that the people behind the Black genocide movement, like Priests for Life and Life Dynamics, do not care about Black babies and Black women. These are often the same people who want to do away with public housing, who won't support state-sponsored child care. Theirs is a feigned concern. They are using the women of color as pawns in a much bigger game. Therefore, they understand what too few of the foot soldiers in the abortion debate do. In abortion politics, all women are sisters, linked by their ability to bear children. If the antis can change the terms of the abortion debate, framing it as a systemic racism perpetrated by big health care institutions against Black people, then they can change the laws around abortion and no one will intervene, not even the white women who need them as well. Their goal, and I'm preaching now and I can't help it, is not actually to curtail abortion services for poor women and women of color, is to limit access to abortion for all women, including and especially white women. Because the thing that all too many white anti-abortion activists really want, which they can't say out loud, is for white women to have more babies in order to push back against the browning of America. As we march toward the reality that by 2050, no one racial or ethnic group will hold a proportional majority in this country, racial suicide paranoia abounds. And for the white racist legislatures in red states, nothing is more threatening than a majority brown country. It strips them of their historic power. The prospect of being outnumbered is what enabled the Tea Party's mutiny of Congress in 2010 after the election of Barack Obama. It is what enabled the it allowed the crippling of the Republican establishment, and it rendered the first major female party presidential candidate powerless. It also enabled the rise of the racist, nationalistic, and misogynistic Donald Trump. Yeah, I said it. Yeah. Thank you. The white people who are still in charge believe that if their women don't start having lots of babies, the white patriarchs are going to become obsolete. 100 years ago, a white politician with this same fear who had hoped to exert control over female fertility would have just said so. In his 1905 speech on American motherhood, Theodore Roosevelt encouraged white women to do their duty and to have at least 2 children or to contemplate race suicide. In these times, such a bald articulation of racist values is impossible, or at least it was. Too many of their own women, that is white women, are working and going to school and running businesses and running for political office and taking birth control pills so that any outward pressure on their daughters, mothers, or sisters or wives to have more children would be risible. And so the white men in charge have invented a workaround. They've tied their antipathy towards abortion together with civil rights and the Black Lives Matter movement. They understand that by curtailing abortion for black women, they curtail it for white women too. It's a sleight of hand and misdirection. And the way I see it, the attack on abortion rights is nothing less than an effort to put all women back in their place. So, life's work, moral arguments for choice. It's simply the notion that what you care about is what you'll do something about. And for me, given that I committed myself to the craft of women's health care, and that in my soul and in my heart, I've always been committed to fairness and justice. For me, what reproductive justice looked like was adding abortion care to my clinical practice of women's health care. And it was to do so in a way that, given that spirituality and Christian religion are in my DNA, it wasn't about setting aside my religious understanding. It was about digging deeper and finding the humanity in my Christian understanding, because Christianity is just one of multiple identities I hold. As we all look at ourselves closely, we all hold multiple identities. The four that I can rattle off for you right away: I'm heterosexual, black, male, and Christian. But I'm never going to be more black, heterosexual, male, or Christian than I am human. And if any of these identities compete with my humanity, I will reject them outright. Those are the types of questions that you have to ask yourself. To know is to become responsible. We know that women deserve the kind of care that includes abortion. The question is, what are we going to do about it? So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your audience. Thank you for your time. And now I'll field questions. So I think how it's going to work, I think people have submitted questions, and I'm going to take those questions. I'm assuming that we have a gatekeeper, because I'll stand up here. When I'm in a space of amongst my peeps, I'll stay here all night. But I think that we have questions, and so I'll get through as many of those questions, and I think we have some time where I will be signing books for people who want to get them. So, shoot.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. Here's the first question.
Chris, can I get my water right there?
I want to make sure you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay. Can you expand more about the intersections between racial and reproductive oppression and how your experience as a black man informs your pursuit of reproductive justice?
So, I'm convinced as a clinician, as a doctor, when you look at a condition and you look at the determining factors of it, you draw some conclusions about what the problem is, and that will inform you what the solution is. And so when I look at racial injustice and reproductive oppression, the common root system, those two plants are potted in the soil of patriarchy. And so the bigger issue for me is to look at how patriarchy, or how hierarchical relationships in our society that privilege males over females facilitate reproductive oppression and racial injustice. The notion that race is something biologic, and we create a hierarchy around skin color, and that like sex, maleness is biologic. The notion that there is some higher purpose or existential purpose or divine plan that says that men should be privileged over women, or males should be privileged over females, and that white people should be privileged over non-white people, that understanding that those things are intimately associated allows me to think about how I do my work in ways that will have solutions that are sustainable and that are comprehensive enough to address the issue. Because if I'm addressing race issues only when the issue is also class and sex, then the solutions that we come up with are going to be inadequate. And so it's been that understanding that as somebody with multiple identities, as I said, being aware of ways in which I'm privileged as a Christian person in a society that declares itself a Christian nation, or ways in which I'm privileged in a patriarchal society that says male or men's rights are more important than women's rights, has informed how I do my work. And what it's led me to do is to anchor my identities. That most essential identity that I'm anchored in is in my humanity. And so that allows me to subordinate other identities that will either privilege me or that will put me in a place to accept subordination. So as a man in a patriarchal society, I am a traitor to patriarchy. I divest of any privilege that would accrue to me simply because I was born male. As a Christian in a pluralistic society where everybody's not Christian, I divest of any notion that God bless America is more God bless the world. And people who are Hindu or who don't have a religious understanding at all, their understanding, their realities are no less valid than mine. So when I pull those all together, it leaves me well positioned to be reality-based and to be a human rights defender in a world that's pluralistic, and that allows me to divest of the privileges that I hold, and it allows me to resist any tyranny that would accrue to me on a demographic I have, like skin color.
Why do you think the abortion rights movement has struggled to talk about abortion in moral and religious terms?
Thank you, that's a great question. I think we struggle to talk about abortion in moral or religious terms because most of us, or many of us in this country, have what I call religious PTSD. We are traumatized by being reared in a society where we've been force-fed religion in general, but a particular type of religion in particular. And when the first thing that we do when we can get out of forced religious training, because in this country and in many places we believe that the only way to train people with regard to morality is to train them in religion. And so for those people who've seen lots of mischief done in the name of religion, and in particular patriarchal, heteronormative, colonial Christianity, they've said, I don't want to have anything to do with that because it doesn't fit the world as it is. And so by wrongly conflating the mischief that's done in the name of religion with the fact that all religion is corrupt, we created a vacuum where the loudest voices or the only religious narrative to be heard is one of opposition to reproductive rights. And it caters to a patriarchal notion of men dominating women, and even looking at childbirth and reproduction as there's a narrative and a mythology in Judeo-Christian texts about childbirth being a curse of a woman because of some notion of a fall into sin. And I jokingly say that since the fall, women have been taking the fall for the fall, right? So I think by abandoning the conversation around morality to people who are religious extremists, we've created a vacuum that has allowed their voice to be in the ascendancy. And as a result, we've gotten policy, and we've gotten an encroachment on the public space, which ends up being the policy space, that has allowed people to enforce their particular religious understanding and to encode it and to enshrine it into law and policy. And so the only pushback on that will be, you can't drive religion out of the public space by becoming anti-religious. There has to be a counter narrative in the same vein. There have to be faith communities that have to speak up and say, that understanding is just that. An understanding is not the understanding. One of the most powerful sermons I ever heard preached in the form of the printed word, because I wasn't around in 1922, was a sermon by the Reverend Harry Emerson Fosdick that said, "Shall the fundamentalists win?" And in that sermon, he basically explored this tension between science and religion, because he said that folk who are fundamentalists, who have dogmas that say that there's only one way to understand Christianity, ultimately devalue that tradition when they insist that there are not other ways to understand it. And he dealt specifically with the expanding scientific knowledge around people who are fundamentalist Christians who have the dogmas that say that you have to believe in virgin birth and bodily resurrection and, the like. He said that there are people who hold the Christian tradition dear, but that they don't believe literally in bodily resurrection or vicarious sacrifice, or virgin birth. But those people are no less authentic in their tradition. So what he's saying is that the answer to religious bigotry and dogma is not anti-religion. It is the raising of the notion that there is religious orthodoxy and that there's heterodoxy, or within religious traditions, there are multiple ways to understand it. And what that means is that the task of driving dangerous religion out of the public space does not fall to non-believers. It falls to prophetic witness from Christian believers. So the thrust of that is that we have to stop abdicating our responsibility to make the moral argument for women. And that's what my book was about. We've made the medical case that abortion is safe. We've even rejected notions that abortion is inhumane by doing the research to find that fetuses can't feel pain. We haven't made is the innate right of women to have agency and to make decisions about their lives and their bodies. And so my attempt is to break that echo chamber and to put an alternative voice into the ether, because the only way people can have a chance to think differently is they have to be exposed to some different ways of thinking.
All right, here's the next question. What do you think will happen if Roe v. Wade is overturned?
I think it will be January 21st, 1973. We'll time travel, and what that means is we'll go back to a time where pre-Roe, there were 3 or 4 states where abortion was legal. And that meant that for the women who could, they tried to get to those states. That means that even more so than now, women's access to the vital health care called abortion will depend on their zip code. That means that women who can get to care, they will. That means that the people who've been apathetic and have not understood the value of abortion being readily available to all, because they felt safe, because they have the economic means to traverse the hurdles. It means that those people will still try and get access, but what those people fail to understand is where there are no providers, there's no access. Where there's no clinics, so all the money in the world won't help you. Billy Zane figured that out in the movie Titanic when he had hundreds of thousands of dollars and they were saying women and children first in the rescue boat, and he went up to a woman and said, "I'll give you $25,000 if you let me take your place on the boat." And she said, "Okay, how's your money gonna help you float?" It's not. So what will happen is we'll go back to a time where women their access will depend on their zip code. So that means that women will be in desperate situations. And so desperate situations like pre-Roe will call for desperate measures. We'll see more do-it-yourself attempts. Whether it'll be the coat hanger, it may not, but it may be people accessing predators on the internet who are selling them herbs and concoctions and potions that may be detrimental to their health. So what we'll also see is we will see more stratified reproduction. We'll see the value of lives matter. Like pre-Roe, the lives of Black women and Latino women were less valuable reproductively than the lives of white women, because we will see people who will have access to services based on means and women who don't, like it was pre-Roe. In New York, 70% of the maternal mortality or unsafe abortion that happened in New York City was for Black and brown women. Meanwhile, white women and women with means were able to get safe, illegal abortions in the hospital because they were able to petition for health waivers. So the clock will go back to January 21st, 1973.
So I think this is our last question, and I think it's a good note to end on. The voice and the political power of antis seems increasingly amplified. Where do you find hope?
I find hope in a faith space full of folk who came to hear a talk about abortion. I find hope in the logic and the wisdom and the prophetic voice and the leadership of Dr. King when he, in the state of Georgia, where he's from, had to rally the civil rights workers when they were feeling particularly overwhelmed by the political power of the governor of Georgia at that time, Governor Lester Maddox. And they came exasperated and said to Dr. King, you know, how are we ever going to get ahead with a racist governor like Lester Maddox in office? Every time we make 2 steps forward, he pushes us 3 steps back. And Dr. King, simply in his otherworldly and precocious wisdom, given that, you know, sometimes I think we lose sight of the fact that Dr. King was only 39 years old when he died. But he was almost otherworldly. He was ahead of his time in many ways. But what he said to them very calmly that provoked them into thinking, into abandoning despair, he said to them quite simply, you know, the last time I checked, God had not left this world to Lester Maddox. Which is to say that if you become hopeless and you lose your effort to try, you know, somebody said whether you believe that you can or whether you believe that you can't, you're right. And so my hope is in the fact that that a few hundred people came in here tonight to hear a conversation about the moral argument for choice. Maybe you're convinced and maybe you're not. But if you were convinced, you're able to think more deeply and you're convinced that we're on the right road. And Dr. King said salvation is not about having arrived at the destination. It's about being on the right road. We're on the right road to freedom and to reproductive justice. This audience is diverse, is plural, and this is the power. This is our power right here. So I'm extremely hopeful because if I didn't, I would do like a lot of folk did on November the 9th. I would close the blinds and I would open the tequila. And that day might come, but it's not today. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I promise not to keep you here for much longer. Like you, I'm very excited to go get my book signed by Dr. Parker. Before I get started, I wanted to thank Dr. Parker for joining us tonight. Of course, preterm for coordinating this event, and our community partners for supporting us. There were so many of them that I actually don't have time to say all of their names. So I'm not even gonna play it cool up here. I pre-ordered this book and finished it probably in 2 days after it arrived. And one thing that I found so special about reading Life's work was that it gave me a chance to reflect on my own journey in abortion activism. So there was one year in particular for me that everything sort of seemed to come together. I began studying reproductive ethics in school. I attended Planned Parenthood protests in Michigan, where I saw generations of women, their partners, and their children fighting for comprehensive reproductive care. And most importantly, 2 women very dear to me needed abortions. So what I learned from them was that it's not uncommon or unique to know someone who's had an abortion. As Dr. Parker mentioned earlier, this is one of the most common procedures. But what was unique was that both of them had the resources, both financial and emotional, to access the care that they needed. And unfortunately, that is not the case for all of our patients. So fast forward 1 year later, I moved to Cleveland to pursue a master's degree at Case Western and to continue my studies about reproductive care. I had the fortune of meeting a former preterm staff member, now very good friend, who invited me to volunteer as a committee member. I think it's safe to say that I am forever indebted to her. So what I learned at preterm was that I became more comfortable openly speaking and honestly speaking about abortion and my stance on the procedure. I learned the power of creating spaces, like this one tonight, no matter the size or place, where providers and their patients can speak their truths. In the years that I've been working with preterm, the Ohio legislature has shown endless determination to end abortion access in Ohio. Providers have battled a number of laws, including heartbeat bills and transfer agreements, causing near irreparable damage to abortion access in Ohio. So this is shown in time. For example, in 2014, this was shortly after I arrived in Cleveland, there were about 12 abortion clinics in Ohio. And today we have only 6. Usually when I hear stats like this, I become a little bit defeated. And I sort of ask myself, where do I fit into this conversation? What can I do to help? Where do I start? Because it seems like there's no way for us to go back. So, on that note, I want to wrap up tonight by asking a few things of you. 1, remember that stigma is fuel for anti-abortion sentiments. And the best way to combat stigma is to talk about abortion in a humanistic way. 2, when you fight for reproductive rights, also fight for reproductive justice, and that includes racial justice. And 3, continue learning about abortion from providers and their patients, because they know better than anybody else what happens in our clinics every day. So again, with that in mind, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for this conversation. And just for one more housekeeping thing, I wanted to remind you that we do have Dr. Parker's book here to be purchased. You will see in the entrance of the church one line where Max Bax is selling the books, and then another one where Dr. Parker will be available to sign your copies. Thank you again and have a good night.